This is the first of two just-in-time videos that I'm going to be doing for Chapter 10, which is all about managing talent. The reason that this chapter requires two videos, again, two short videos, is because the subject matter, I think most people would agree, can be fairly controversial, and so I want to make sure to raise some of the issues that might be on your minds. So, managing talent. Now, one of the most intriguing aspects about this chapter, I think, is the approach that's recommended. I think it would be relatively straightforward for a person to argue that it doesn't seem to be very well aligned with the whole notion of the triple bottom line, in particular, the people part of the equation. And what I think I like most about this chapter is that it is provocative, that there are elements to it which make a lot of good sense, and other elements which I think force us to really think quite carefully about how do we see the people who comprise our organizations. What role do we think they play? What obligation do we have to those folks? And really just how important is their individual satisfaction relative to the organization's ends. So let me dive in. According to Lawler and Worley, really the task when we talk about talent management is making sure to get the right people into key jobs. I think very few people could find anything to disagree about in terms of that statement alone. That seems pretty straightforward. It's also noted that in an SMO, and I would say really in any organization, that people are the organization's most important asset. If you go back to when Robert Reich was the Secretary of Labor under President Clinton, this was something that he talked about quite a bit, that really when you're trying to look at different organizations and what distinguishes one from another, the individual people who comprise that organization, they are really the key. They are sort of the secret weapon, if you will. Now, it's one thing for an organization to say this. I mean, I don't know about you, but I've heard so many times, people are our most important asset, blah, 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 blah. And then we mistreat those people. We don't pay them a living wage. We don't offer them benefits that are comparable to what they might find in industry. They have jobs that are less than satisfying. They have jobs that are not designed to be intrinsically motivated. I could go on and on. But the point is, if you're going to say something, you need to follow through. You have to walk the talk. Now, Lawler and Worley sort of summarize some different talent management approaches in the early parts of the chapter before they dive into some of what they call principles. So let me summarize some of that. They talk about, again, CCOs versus HIOs versus SMOs. And one of the things that they say is that, and I think this is a really important quote, most employees simply aren't a critically important asset or stakeholder and should not be treated as such. And you can find that quote on page 228 of the book. Now, I'd like you to ponder that and consider, how does that fit into the triple bottom line? I mean, is it their understanding that when we talk about the people part of, people, profit, planet, that we're only talking about people outside the organization? Are we not also talking about the people in the organization, the people who make that organization? And certainly if somebody, well, let's just put it this way, if it's been important enough to create a job, then how could you argue that the person occupying that job isn't important? Just ponder that for 30 seconds. I mean, if the person isn't important, then why do we have the job? Maybe we shouldn't have that job. If that job isn't helping us to accomplish our mission, if it isn't enabling us to have whatever competitive advantage we want to talk about having, then why do we have it? I mean, to me, that's the real issue. They also said that HIOs focus on having a long-term relationship with employees and commit to job stability and career development. They then argue that this can produce inflexibility, at least in terms of costs and workforce capability. I would ask you to consider the possibility that Lawler and Worley are imagining this in what I would consider to be fairly old-fashioned terms. In other words, they're somehow arguing that when you decide to treat people well, that basically that what that means is you can never ask them to enhance their capabilities. You can't ask them to develop professionally. You can't expect them to continue growing in exchange for anything that might be perceived as stability. And I think that's a straw man approach. I think, in fact, you can offer stability to the extent that such a thing has any meaning. I mean, let's be honest. There are no guarantees in any industry. There are no guarantees in any job. And I think most people understand that. That said, people also understand, for the most part anyway, that if they want to do everything they can to assure themselves of continuing employment, then it's reasonable to expect that they'll have to change what they do, at least over time. Now, when people fall out of that understanding, it's typically because, frankly, they've been allowed to continue to do things the same old way for a really long period of time, and they've been reinforced for doing that. So, again, assuming that most people are pretty rational, in other words, they do things for a reason, if you've got people believing that job security should be theirs without them ever having to change their behavior, that's because you've created a system in which that belief is reinforced. So really what you need to do if you want to change that perception is you've got to change the system in which these people find themselves working. Lawler and Worley argue that SMOs need talent management approaches that recognize the need for sustainable effectiveness in a context that demands agility and innovation. Okay, all of that sounds great, doesn't it? And they say, basically their way of interpreting that is you can't promise long-term employment to anybody. Okay. Interesting. So, in other words, I like you and today you're valuable, but I'm not going to invest in you in such a way so as to ensure that you continue to be valuable. Or let's say we just decide to move out of a line of business. I'm not going to help you be in a position where you could find another opportunity for yourself that would be at least as good as the one you've had with my organization. That seems quite fascinating, and we'll talk some more about this in just a little bit. Instead, what Lawler and Worley argue is that we ought to spend more time thinking about the possibilities associated with virtual employment, temporary employment, outsourcing, contingent employment. In other words, anything that makes it clear to people that they're not an essential part of the organization. Now, the cynical of you might argue that this is simply a ploy to avoid having to pay benefits. That when organizations commit to longer-term employment contracts, whether it's an actual written contract or a psychological contract, part of what they also agree to under those conditions typically will be some compensation in the form of benefits. And when you hire people as part-time workers or simply as contractors, then you're not on the hook for any of those benefits. At least that's what a cynical person might argue. And I think there might be some validity to that argument. I mean, you have to wonder what's in it for us. What's in it for the individuals? What's in it for the organization? And if a particular methodology is continually employed, then somebody's gaining somehow. I think part of the issue is this notion of trying to balance, again, the social bottom line, where you are sort of blatantly disregarding people's expectation that they're going to somehow give 100% of themselves for some time frame, knowing that at any given point, with or without warning, they could be told, thanks, but no thanks. We're done. We're not going to be together anymore. Their economic rationale is that it's expensive and slow to change the skills and competencies of individuals. Hiring somebody who already has the needed skills often is cheaper and less risky than trying to develop such skills in an existing employee. That quote's on page 230. That's one of those quotes that if somebody said it to me in a face-to-face conversation, I would say, prove it. Show me the data. I don't buy it without the data. I want to see that you've done sort of an across-the-board across positions, across levels, across organizations, some kind of data collection analysis that demonstrates the veracity of that particular quote. I'm not sure that that's true, quite honestly, and I don't know that you should simply take it for granted. That sounds to me like one of these things that you might try to push forward on the basis of face validity, meaning, at least for some people on the face of it, it seems like it could be reasonably true. But, as critical thinkers, we need to say, show me the data, prove it to me. At the same time, the authors acknowledge that it may be necessary to commit more time and money to managers and their professional development, but not necessarily to lower level employees. The clear managerial preference expressed by the authors sometimes, I think, demonstrates their own, perhaps it's a lack of experience working in organizations, or at least being observant about what happens in organizations. And again, recognizing that regardless of a person's level in the organization, we're not simply hiring them for their brawn, but we're also hiring them for their brains and their emotional commitment. Because that's when people go above and beyond. And whether we're talking about production or services, doesn't matter what the industry is, ultimately, the competitive advantage is often found in the behaviors of the people who work for your organization. Now, in the midst of all this, the authors also acknowledge that sometimes you're going to have to spend the money to go ahead and develop the people you have within the organization, because maybe there's a shortage of the talent that you're looking for out in the rest of the world, that you can't find the people you need. So then you're going to have to spend the money. And I would say, for the most part, why wouldn't you do that pretty typically, unless the talent that you need is just so unusual that you don't have anybody perhaps already on staff who can be developed into having a particular skill. Okay. This whole travel light, this whole approach, at least on the face of it, arguably serves the company and does very little for the employees. Can you think of possible advantages for the employees? From the perspective of the individual, what might be kind of nice about a travel light approach? How might it serve their interests? If, let's say, all organizations adopted this approach, which I can't reasonably foresee, but let's just pretend for the sake of argument that they did that, could that make your life better in some respects, and that you would be okay maybe working for a company for, a short 18-month stint, and now I'm going to move on to the next thing. I'm going to try out something different. I want to work on my skill portfolio, if you will, by going from this organization to that one to that one. People already do this, right? Some people do anyway. This is how they advance. They go from one organization to the next to the next. That's how they sort of continually move up. So it could be advantageous in that regard. It could also be advantageous in the regard that you're always working for a company that really and truly, at least apparently, appreciates what you have to bring right this minute. Of course, the flip side is you are also responsible for all of your own professional development. Under those circumstances, if that's the way the work world is going to be, I might charge more for when I am hired, because I have to cover the costs associated with making sure that I have the skills and knowledge that those companies are looking for. The cost issue is a real conundrum. Somebody has to pay for the professional development. Either the organization can pay for it, or it can externalize the costs of that professional development to individuals, to educational institutions, to other organizations. No matter how you look at it, somebody's got to pay for it. Where in the food chain does it get paid for?